Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Brittany, the head instructor and co-founder of Mordhau Historical Combat in Mesa, Arizona. Today I'm going to be talking to you about kicks within historical European martial arts sources. I often get asked the question, why are there no kicks in HEMA? And my answer is usually, there are. However, they're not super common in tournaments, and we're going to talk about that today. But what I'd like to look at is some of the different examples that we have in our sources or our historical texts. Before we get into our medieval or Renaissance sources that HEMA is known for, we have to acknowledge that there are historical examples or artifacts of examples of kicks existing in early European martial traditions. Pancration, or pankration, was one of the earliest examples of a European martial art. In fact, we have this example here of a Panathenaic prize amphora from around 500 BC that is depicting what we think is actually a kick. So we know that kicks existed, obviously, and this is sort of interesting because when people think of kicks, usually they go and think of Eastern martial traditions, which is fine, but there is a long history of kicks existing in European martial traditions, as we can see here. I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to assume that these martial traditions, and kicks especially, would have continued for centuries into the medieval era. And this leads us into the first HEMA source that I'd like to present to you. This is the Walpurgis Festbuch, otherwise known as the MSI 33. Some people call it MS 133, but either way, this is the oldest known HEMA manual that we have. It's not necessarily the very first one or the oldest to ever exist. There could be older sources, but this is the oldest that we actually have that we know of in museums or private collections so far. And this one in particular is dating from around the 1320s. You can see here that the two images, one shows an envelopment, and then it shows the counter to the envelopment actually just discarding the sword and the buckler, and instead going for a kick from behind. Now, I'll probably come back to this in a little bit to talk about tactics and how to use the kick within HEMA, but I wanted to start with this source just because it is the earliest HEMA manual that we currently know of. Now, as you've already figured out, HEMA is more than just longsword, even though that seems to be the popular weapon of choice these days. But at the very core of a longsword art, or any sword fighting art, is actually wrestling. And for anybody that does KDF, you will recognize this as ringen. So within the variety of wrestling manuscripts, or even just the instances where wrestling is mentioned in the entirety of a sword fighting manuscript, there is a plethora of instances where we see kicks being utilized in the grapple. And this example here from around the 1420s is no exception. It says, "Thus you shall kick him on the knee with whichever foot is foremost with full effort, pulling him toward the leg. Then push him up until you meet him correctly. So you go kick him outside the joint and then he falls." Now this is really interesting because ending up with a heel towards the knee, or even the ankle, but in this case in particular at the knee, this can actually end up breaking joints. Now there's no submissions in wrestling that we know of. I mean, they were training as a martial art rather than a sport, so if you're practicing with your partner, obviously, don't break their knee, but if you're really training to have some sort of efficiency in hurting, maiming, or killing somebody, I guess, going right for a joint break or dislocation, super effective. And obviously we see this being the case in many different sources, but this is just one example here of kicking into the joint itself. Now, sometimes the translation ends up being kick, but I don't think that it's supposed to be kick in and of itself. I think it's supposed to be like the motion that the feet have in order to facilitate a throw in grappling, such as we see here for Otyud from 1452. It says, "If he stands with his right leg forward, pull his right arm with your left hand, kick him in the ankle of his right leg with your left leg, and throw him to the ground." So in this case, I think it's facilitating a throw as opposed to it actually being a hard strike with the foot itself as a kick, but the translation is kick. It also goes on to say, or you can, in addition to the kick, use your right hand to hit him in the throat and throw him onto his back. I just had to keep that little quote in there because there's something so satisfying about, hit him in the throat. I just couldn't leave that part out. Now, of course, we can look at how kicks are utilized with weapons. In this case here, the example that I have, this is from Hans Talhofer, and you can see that this is a kick from behind, and perhaps this maybe looks familiar. Recall the MS 133, where we see a very similar action as a kick from behind. So you may have noticed that these kicks are straight kicks or push kicks right on the center line, as opposed to fancy roundhouse kicks or anything like that. These are really simple center line kicks. And we see another example of a straight kick here, seen in the Berlin sketchbook circa 1512. This is thought by art historians to have been created in the workshop of Albrecht Dürer, not necessarily by Dürer himself, but again, art historians are not able to confidently attribute a specific artist to this work. However, again, we see this straight kick from the bind in Longsword. It's important to note that these kicks were rarely done on their own as a standalone attack outside of measure or in Zufechten. Rather, these end up being executed in very close measure. One, obviously, because you have to be close enough to kick someone, but two, when there's weapons involved, you have to be really aware of the danger. You wouldn't just start throwing kicks from, 8 feet away trying to work your way in when you have a weapon. That just doesn't make sense. Now, we've shown straight kicks. Here's an example of a side kick. Here we have the Codex Guelph 83-4 from 1591, and it says, quote, "When the opponent thrusts as above, the agent grabs him by the fist, twisting it downward, and kicks him in the side with all of his strength." What I find interesting with this image in particular is that in depicting a side kick, you can actually see the agent on the right, that's with the green stockings. He turns his body, and the artist has gone so far as to show the orientation of the foot. Now, the foot that is planted has thus turned. Normally, when you're fighting with or without a weapon, the feet, more or less, should be pointed towards your opponent so that your hips can be square as well without having the knee or the ankle out of alignment. So you can see that they must have taken some sort of step with a pivot in order to execute this side kick. And as well, in regards to this particular manuscript, we see another instance of a historical source showing a kick with not just a longsword, but we've covered sword and buckler, and now we actually have rondel, possibly even unarmed versus armed here. This particular manuscript is actually really interesting. You may have noticed that the majority of kicks within the manuals that I've shown you so far have been those straight kicks or push kicks, and this one's sort of different in the sense that it does show a side kick, and I'm not really super familiar with a lot of other sources that actually do show side kicks or even say to use a side kick. The other reason I really like this source has nothing to do with kicks at all, but because it is really beautifully detailed, it's beautifully colored, the anatomical accuracy is just really, really, really cool, and from an art history perspective, that means a lot to me. So take some time and check this one out. So far, all of the sources that we have covered here have been exclusively of German origin. Now, kicks within the Hema tradition aren't just exclusive to German sources, but we see them come up in other regional sources, such as Achille Marazzo here, which says, quote, "If the enemy throws a blow, you will defend with a thrust, and step with the left leg and give a kick to the stomach with the right foot," etc., etc., etc. Now we can assume that this would then be executed in a straight kick like we'd seen before. Very similar to Fiore, which says, quote, When I am crossed with someone and come to the narrow, I strike his testicles with my right foot. Very specific in the targeting. The other sources don't necessarily explain where to target, but Fiore, in very Fiore style, makes no bones about it. He's just kicking right to the balls. As I said, other sources aren't always so specific about where to target, but like Fiore, this exact play from Paulus Hector Mare is very specific. It tells you to kick him in the groin with the left foot, grab the blade with both hands, and deliver a death blow to his head with cross and pommel so that he falls to the ground half dead. So in this case with Paulus Hector Mare, it's not enough to just kick them in the balls. You have to add some insult to the injury and then Mordhau them. If you don't know what a Mordhau is, do yourself a favor, look it up. Super, super cool as a technique. Don't ever do it in a tournament. I also have here an example of not a kick, but I guess a strike with the foot from Meyer in The Art of Combat, and it says, "Take heed whenever he holds his foot steady and stamp on it." So like I said, not a kick, but you are then stomping on their foot. So now if we just zoom in a little bit to the top right, we can actually see this technique being used. The person on the left in yellow is stomping on the foot of the person on the right in red. You can see their foot on top of the other there if you look carefully. Now, whether that's actually using the heel to stomp down on the toes and create injury, or if that's actually just using the foot to step on the other person's foot to sort of trap them and prevent them from getting away, I'm not sure which it is, and it could totally be both. Like, viably, you could use both tactics. So this is actually mentioned specifically in Meyer's Dagger, but since we interpret Meyer as a complete system, I don't think this would be too far-fetched to actually apply it within Longsword as well. We've sort of progressed through this somewhat chronologically, so sticking with that theme, we're going to move right along into 1663. We have Johannes George Pasha, and he says, quote, "While fencing, when your opponent cuts or thrusts, parry, step, and kick away his front foot with your leg." So when you make your defense with your parry and they have overextended in their lunge, then you kick out their foot. Naturally, they would fall because I'm assuming they would be planted and forward weighted on that front leg. And so this is actually a really interesting technique in order to utilize like a little kick. Again, not like a traditional kick that we're used to, like the straight kicks or the big motions that we've seen previously, but this is just another example of a strike with the foot. I've covered some historical examples of kicks within HEMA, and I did say at the beginning of this that I would cover like using kicks in tournaments or why we don't see them very often in tournaments. There's a few reasons for that. One, some tournament rule sets just flat out say no, they ban kicks and strikes in general. I guess for safety, and that makes sense. Some tournaments do allow it, and that's where you might actually see kicks happening. But a lot of the time it's not trained because in order to actually execute a kick, you should have proper training, and most people just want to take their time and spend their time learning how to actually use a sword and spend less time focusing on kicks, strikes, and grappling, which in my opinion is sort of a shame. To each their own though, only because wrestling and grappling is such a foundational part of learning sword fighting that if you neglect that entirely, I don't think that you're actually getting the whole picture with how to fight with a sword. So I like to train kicks, I like to train strikes, I like to train grappling, but I don't often use it in tournaments. One, because of the rule sets. Two, I can't guarantee that my opponent usually is, they're my friend. I can't guarantee that they are trained to be able to accept strikes in a way or throws in a way. I can't guarantee they know how to break fall. And as well, if you do it to somebody in a tournament, you strike them or you kick them, it can actually sometimes be perceived as being kind of rude. So that's a big reason why it's not done. But it happens sometimes, and it just depends on the rule set and the club's training as well. Obviously, I didn't cover every single instance of kicks within the historical sources, and I am by no means saying exactly when to execute a kick or how to execute a kick. There are lots of other things and sources on that. This was just supposed to be an overview for you to get an idea of how kicks are presented within the sources and that they do in fact exist. So with that, thank you so much for watching, you guys. I really do appreciate your support. If you want to come check me out over on Instagram, you can find me at saint.leafy. Thanks again, guys.